Sarah Martinez wiped down the last table at the small diner where she worked the night shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she glanced at the clock showing 2:47 a.m. Her feet ached from standing for 12 hours straight, but she couldn't afford to complain. This job, along with her morning shift at the grocery store, barely covered her rent and her younger brother's school supplies. As she untied her apron, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. The sleeve of her uniform had ridden up slightly, revealing the edge of an intricate tattoo that covered most of her left arm. She quickly pulled the fabric down, a habit she'd developed over the past 3 years since getting the ink done. The tattoo was beautiful, meaningful, and represented the most important person in her life. But it had also become a source of constant judgment from others. The design was a military-style memorial piece featuring dog tags, an American flag, and a portrait of a young man in uniform. Wrapped around these central elements were ribbons with dates and coordinates, along with a quote in elegant script lettering. The artwork was professionally done, every line crisp and every shadow perfectly placed. But most people who saw it made assumptions before asking questions. Sarah had moved to this small town in Colorado 6 months ago, hoping for a fresh start. She'd left behind the whispers and stares of her previous city, where everyone knew her story. Here, she thought she could blend in, work hard, save money, and maybe even go back to school someday. But small towns had their own challenges, and news traveled fast among the tight-knit community. The trouble started during her second week at the diner. Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer who seemed to know everyone's business, had noticed the tattoo when Sarah reached across the table to refill her coffee. The older woman's expression had shifted from friendly to disapproving in an instant. By the next day, half the town seemed to know that the new waitress had gang tattoos and was probably trouble. Sarah tried to explain to anyone who would listen that the tattoo was a memorial, not gang-related artwork. But once rumors started in a small town, they took on a life of their own. Some customers would deliberately request different servers when they saw her approaching. Others would leave smaller tips or make snide comments about people who mark up their bodies. The grocery store where she worked mornings was even worse. The manager, Mr. Collins, had called her into his office after receiving complaints from customers. He didn't fire her, but he made it clear that she needed to keep her tattoo covered at all times. Sarah started wearing long sleeves even in the summer heat, and thick foundation makeup on the parts that sometimes showed despite her efforts. Her younger brother Danny noticed the change in her when he visited from the city where he was finishing high school. At 19, Sarah was only 3 years older than Danny, but she'd been his guardian since their parents died in a car accident 4 years earlier. She'd dropped out of college to take care of him, working multiple jobs to keep them afloat while he finished school. "Why do you always wear long sleeves now?" Danny asked during one of his weekend visits. "You used to love that tattoo. You said it was the most important thing you'd ever done." Sarah forced a smile and changed the subject, but Danny's words stayed with her. He was right. The tattoo had been important to her, meaningful in a way that most people couldn't understand. She'd saved for months to afford the work by one of the best artists in the state. Every element had been carefully chosen and personally significant. But now, living under the constant weight of judgment and assumption, Sarah began to question her decision. Maybe she should have chosen a design that could be easily hidden. Maybe she should consider laser removal, though she knew she couldn't afford the process. The thought of erasing something so meaningful made her heart ache. But the daily struggle of defending herself was wearing her down. One particularly difficult shift at the diner. A group of teenagers had come in after a football game. They'd pointed at her arm and made loud comments about trashy tattoos and probably drugs too. Sarah had excused herself to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes before returning to finish her shift. That night, she seriously considered looking into removal options. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd moved to this small town hoping to honor the memory represented in her tattoo, yet she was being forced to hide it. The man memorialized in the artwork had believed in service, honor, and standing up for what was right. Here she was, covering up his memory because of other people's ignorance. Sarah's savings account remained nearly empty despite working 2 jobs because everything went to basic expenses and Danny's needs. She'd put her own dreams on hold indefinitely, but she was determined that her brother would graduate and have the opportunities their parents would have wanted for him. Some nights, exhausted and discouraged, she wondered if she was strong enough to keep going. As she walked home from the diner that night, Sarah passed the town's war memorial in the small park downtown. She paused, as she always did, to read the names carved into the stone. Some dated back to World War II, others to Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. These men and women were heroes to this community, honored and remembered. Yet somehow her tribute to one of them was seen as something shameful. The contradiction frustrated her more than she could express. In the darkness of the park, with no one around to see, Sarah pushed up her sleeve and traced the lines of her tattoo with her finger. Tomorrow would bring another day of hiding, another day of judgment, another day of pretending that the most meaningful artwork on her body was something to be ashamed of. But tonight, alone with her memories and her tribute, Sarah allowed herself to remember why she'd gotten the tattoo in the first place, and why it would always be worth defending, no matter what anyone else thought. The next morning at the grocery store, Sarah's day started badly and only got worse. A new customer, an elderly man with a veteran's cap, had seen her tattoo when she bent down to retrieve a dropped item. Instead of the usual disapproving look, his face had turned red with anger. "That's disgusting," he'd said loudly enough for other shoppers to hear. "Young people today have no respect. Putting gang symbols on your body like that. In my day, we respected the military. We didn't mock it with street art." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment and frustration. She wanted to explain, to tell him that her tattoo was actually a tribute, not mockery. But Mr. Collins appeared before she could say anything, apologizing profusely to the veteran and shooting Sarah a warning look that meant, "Keep quiet and get back to work." The incident followed her through the rest of her shift. Other employees whispered among themselves, and she caught fragments of their conversations. Probably stolen valor. Disrespectful. Why would Collins hire someone like that? During her lunch break, Sarah sat in her car and called Danny. She needed to hear a friendly voice, someone who understood what the tattoo really meant. But when he answered, she could hear the excitement in his voice as he talked about college applications and scholarship opportunities. She couldn't bring herself to burden him with her problems when he was finally moving forward with his life. Instead, she listened to him talk about his plans, his dreams of studying engineering, his gratitude for everything she'd sacrificed to make his education possible. When he mentioned visiting next weekend, Sarah felt a mix of joy and anxiety. She loved seeing Danny, but she was running out of ways to hide how difficult things had become. That afternoon, during the shift change between her grocery store job and the diner, Sarah stopped at the library. She used their computer to research tattoo removal options, hoping maybe she could find something affordable. The prices made her stomach drop. Even the cheapest options would cost thousands of dollars. Money she simply didn't have. As she was leaving the library, she bumped into Mrs. Patterson, one of the few people in town who'd been consistently kind to her. Mrs. Patterson was a retired teacher who came into the diner regularly for pie and coffee. She'd never mentioned Sarah's tattoo, never given her dirty looks, and always left decent tips. "Sarah, dear, you look upset," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice gentle with concern. "Is everything all right?" For a moment, Sarah considered opening up to this kind woman. But what could she say? That she was being judged for honoring someone's memory? That she was considering erasing something meaningful because of other people's ignorance? Instead, she forced a smile and said she was just tired from working double shifts. Mrs. Patterson studied her face for a moment, and Sarah had the feeling that the older woman saw more than she was letting on. "You know," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, "I taught high school for 30 years. I learned that sometimes the things that make us different are the very things that make us special. Don't let anyone convince you to change the parts of yourself that matter." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected, and she had to blink back tears. Mrs. Patterson patted her arm gently and walked away, leaving Sarah standing on the library steps with emotions she couldn't quite name. At the diner that evening, the dinner rush was particularly busy. A new family had moved to town, and they'd brought several relatives to try the local food. Sarah was serving their table when their youngest daughter, maybe 7 years old, noticed her tattoo peeking out from under her sleeve. "That's pretty," the little girl said innocently. "What is it?" Before Sarah could answer, the girl's mother quickly shushed her and apologized to Sarah with an embarrassed expression. "I'm sorry. She doesn't know better than to comment on people's choices." The word choices was said with a particular tone that made it clear what the mother thought of those choices. Sarah felt the familiar burn of shame and anger. But this time something else stirred inside her. The little girl had seen beauty in her tattoo, while the adults around her had taught her to see shame. Later that night, as Sarah was closing up the diner, she found herself thinking about Mrs. Patterson's words and the little girl's innocent comment. She pulled up her sleeve and really looked at her tattoo in the fluorescent light. The artwork was stunning, the memorial was meaningful, and the man it honored had deserved every bit of tribute she could give him. The tattoo showed Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, a Navy SEAL who had died saving his unit in Afghanistan 3 years ago. The dates and coordinates marked the place and time of his final mission. The quote wrapped around the design read, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." James had been Sarah's boyfriend since high school. They'd planned to marry when he returned from his deployment. He'd encouraged her to go to college, supported her dreams, and had been the steadiest, most honorable person she'd ever known. When he died, Sarah felt like her world had ended. The tattoo had been her way of ensuring that his sacrifice, his memory and his love would always be with her. Now, 3 years later, she was hiding that tribute because people saw ink on skin and made assumptions about her character. The irony was bitter. James had died defending the freedom of people who now judged her for honoring his memory. As Sarah walked home that night, she made a decision that surprised her. Tomorrow was Saturday, her day off from both jobs. Instead of spending it doing laundry and catching up on sleep, she was going to visit the town's VFW hall. She'd noticed it several times but had never gone inside. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start having conversations with people who might actually understand what her tattoo represented. The decision scared her, but it also felt right. James had never been one to back down from a challenge, and he'd taught her to stand up for what mattered. Her tattoo mattered. His memory mattered. And maybe, just maybe, there were people in this town who would understand that once they knew the real story. Sarah fell asleep that night with more determination than she'd felt in months, though she had no idea that her decision to visit the VFW would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Saturday morning arrived gray and cloudy, matching Sarah's nervous mood. She changed clothes 3 times, unsure what someone wore to a VFW hall. Finally, she settled on jeans and a simple sweater, making sure her tattoo was completely covered. Old habits died hard, even when she was planning to reveal the truth. The VFW hall sat on a quiet street near downtown, a modest brick building with a faded sign and a flagpole out front. Sarah parked across the street and sat in her car for 10 minutes, gathering courage. Through the windows, she could see several older men sitting around tables, drinking coffee and talking. What if they reacted the same way everyone else had? What if they thought she was being disrespectful by getting a military tattoo when she'd never served? Finally, Sarah forced herself out of the car and walked to the front door. A bell chimed as she entered, and conversation stopped as 5 men turned to look at her. The silence stretched uncomfortably until an older man with kind eyes and a Vietnam veteran cap stood up. "Can we help you, miss?" he asked politely. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm new in town and I wanted to show you something and ask if you think I'm being disrespectful." The men exchanged glances, clearly puzzled by her unusual request. The Vietnam vet, who introduced himself as Frank, gestured to an empty chair. "Have a seat. I'm Frank. This is Bill, Tom, Robert, and Jerry. We're always happy to talk to young folks, especially if you've got questions about military service." Sarah sat down, her heart pounding. "I have a tattoo," she began, then stopped. "That probably sounds silly, but people in town they think it's gang-related or disrespectful to the military. I wanted to ask veterans what they thought." "Well, let's have a look," said Bill, a heavy-set man with gentle eyes. "Can't judge something we can't see." Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed up her sleeve and extended her arm. The room went completely silent. She watched their faces carefully, expecting to see the same disapproval she'd encountered everywhere else. Instead, she saw surprise, recognition, and something that looked like respect. Frank leaned forward, studying the details. "Master Sergeant James Rodriguez," he read quietly. "Navy SEAL Team 6, this is memorial work." "You knew him?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Knew of him," Frank replied. "His story made the rounds in military circles. He saved 8 men when his unit was ambushed, stayed behind to provide cover while they evacuated wounded. Posthumous Medal of Honor recipient." The other men nodded solemnly. Jerry, who had been silent until now, spoke up. This is beautiful work, respectful, honorable. Who was he to you? Sarah felt tears threatening. We were engaged.
He was supposed to come home and we were going to get married.
Instead, I got a folded flag and the promise that his sacrifice mattered. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was the silence of men who understood loss, who had seen friends fall, who knew that some wounds never fully healed. And people in town have been giving you grief about this? Tom asked, his voice carrying an edge of anger. They think it's gang-related, Sarah explained, or that I'm somehow mocking the military. I've been covering it up for months, working 2 jobs just to get by, and listening to people make assumptions about my character because of the ink on my skin. That's ridiculous, Robert said firmly. This is one of the finest memorial tattoos I've ever seen. Every detail shows respect and love. Anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't know what they're looking at. Frank stood up and walked to a wall covered with photos and memorabilia. We've got a memorial wall here, he said. Pictures of local boys who didn't make it home. Some information about their service. Would you mind if we added a photo of James? We like to honor all service members, not just the local ones. Sarah was overwhelmed. For the first time in months, she was being treated with respect instead of judgment. I'd be honored, she managed to say. Good, Frank said. Now about this town giving you trouble. That needs to stop. Most folks around here just don't understand military culture, but that's no excuse for treating you poorly. Bill nodded in agreement. We've got some influence in this community. People respect veterans even if they don't always understand us. Maybe it's time we had some conversations with folks about what they're really looking at when they see your tattoo. The men spent the next hour asking Sarah about James, about their relationship, and about his service. She found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. Memories of his dedication to his team, his sense of humor, his dreams for after the military. These men understood the culture, the sacrifice, the brotherhood that James had died protecting. You know, Jerry said thoughtfully, we're having our monthly pancake breakfast next Saturday. It's a fundraiser, but it's also a community event. Half the town shows up. Maybe you'd consider joining us and bringing some photos of James to share. People need to understand who they've been judging. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of publicly revealing her story, but she also felt a new sense of determination. I think James would want me to stand up for his memory, she said. Damn right he would, Frank said firmly. A SEAL doesn't back down from a fight, and neither should the woman who loved one. As Sarah prepared to leave, the men exchanged contact information with her and promised to spread the word about the real meaning behind her tattoo. For the first time since moving to town, she felt like she might have allies. Driving home, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. She thought about calling Danny to tell him about the morning, but decided to wait until she had more to report. Something told her that this was just the beginning of a much larger change in her life. That evening, as she got ready for her shift at the diner, Sarah made another decision that surprised her. Instead of her usual long-sleeved uniform shirt, she put on a short-sleeved one. Her tattoo would be visible, and she was ready to answer questions honestly for the first time since arriving in town. The woman looking back at her in the mirror looked different somehow. Still tired from working 2 jobs, still grieving a loss that would never fully heal, but no longer ashamed of the way she chose to honor that loss. James would be proud of her for finally standing up, she thought, and that realization gave her the courage to face whatever reactions the evening might bring. Sarah's first customer of the evening shift was Mrs. Henderson, the woman whose disapproval had started much of Sarah's trouble in town. When Mrs. Henderson saw the exposed tattoo, her eyebrows shot up and her mouth pursed in the familiar expression of disapproval Sarah had come to dread. I thought Mr. Peterson told you to keep that covered, Mrs. Henderson said sharply, loud enough for other customers to hear. This time, instead of apologizing and pulling down her sleeve, Sarah stood straighter. It's a memorial tattoo for a Navy SEAL who died in Afghanistan, she said clearly. Master Sergeant James Rodriguez. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously for saving his unit. Mrs. Henderson's expression faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. Well, that may be, but it's still inappropriate for a young lady to mark herself up like that. What would your parents think? My parents died 4 years ago, Sarah replied calmly. James helped me through that loss, and I helped him prepare for deployment. We were engaged when he was killed in action. The directness of Sarah's response clearly caught Mrs. Henderson off guard. Other customers at nearby tables had stopped eating to listen to the exchange. Sarah could feel their attention, but for the first time she wasn't ashamed of it. Mrs. Patterson walked in just as the tension was reaching its peak. She took in the scene quickly and approached Sarah's station with a warm smile. "Sarah, dear, could I have my usual table? And I'd love to hear more about that beautiful artwork on your arm. It looks like it has quite a story." The kindness in Mrs. Patterson's voice broke some of the tension, and Mrs. Henderson retreated to her booth without further comment. As Sarah seated Mrs. Patterson, the older woman whispered, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." The rest of the evening brought mixed reactions. Some customers asked questions about the tattoo with genuine curiosity. Once they understood it was a memorial, others remained uncomfortable or disapproving. But Sarah answered every question honestly, and with each conversation she felt stronger. The biggest test came when a group of high school students came in after a basketball game. These were the same kids who had made cruel comments about her tattoo the week before. This time, when one of them pointed and started to make a joke, Sarah walked directly to their table. "Last week you called this a trashy tattoo," she said, addressing the group but looking specifically at the boy who had been loudest in his mockery. "I want you to know that this is a memorial for Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, a Navy SEAL who died saving 8 men in Afghanistan. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was also the man I was going to marry." The teenagers fell silent, clearly uncomfortable with the serious turn the conversation had taken. The boy who had made the original comments looked down at his menu, his face red with embarrassment. "I'm not angry with you," Sarah continued, "but I want you to understand that when you mock someone's tattoos, you might be mocking something sacred to them. This represents the most important person in my life and his sacrifice for our country." One of the girls in the group, someone Sarah recognized as the student council president, spoke up quietly. "We're really sorry. We didn't know. That's actually really beautiful, honoring him like that." As Sarah walked away from their table, she heard them having a hushed conversation about military service and sacrifice. Maybe she'd given them something to think about. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the small town's gossip network. By the next morning, Sarah's story had been discussed in coffee shops, beauty salons, and church groups throughout the community. The reactions were mixed, but the conversation had shifted from judgment about her appearance to questions about her story. At the grocery store Monday morning, Mr. Collins called Sarah into his office. She expected another lecture about keeping her tattoo covered, but instead found him looking uncomfortable and apologetic. "I've been hearing around town about the real meaning behind your tattoo," he began awkwardly. "I want to apologize for asking you to cover it up. I didn't understand what it represented." Sarah was surprised by his admission. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'd like to make it right," Mr. Collins continued. "We're going to be hiring for an assistant manager position soon. You're one of our most reliable employees, and if you're interested, I'd like you to apply. The pay is significantly better, and it would mean you could cut back to one job if you wanted." The offer was unexpected and generous. Sarah thanked him and said she'd definitely apply, though part of her wondered if the offer was motivated more by guilt than merit. Either way, it represented an opportunity for a better life. That afternoon, Frank from the VFW called her. "We've been making some calls around town," he said, "setting some folks straight about what your tattoo really means. Most people are embarrassed about how they treated you once they understand the truth." "I appreciate that," Sarah said, "but I don't want people to be nice to me just because they feel guilty." "That's not what this is about," Frank replied firmly. "This is about respect. You've been honoring a fallen hero, and this community needs to recognize that. We'd still like you to come to the pancake breakfast this Saturday. Bring some photos of James. Let people meet the man behind the memorial." As the week progressed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how people treated her. Some customers at the diner asked about her tattoo with genuine interest rather than judgment. Others simply treated her with more basic courtesy than they had before. A few people apologized directly for their previous behavior. The most meaningful change came from an unexpected source. The veteran who had yelled at her at the grocery store appeared at the diner on Thursday evening. Sarah tensed when she saw him, expecting another confrontation. Instead, he approached her with his hat in his hands. "Miss, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I heard about your young man, about what your tattoo really means. I served in Vietnam and I lost friends too. What you did honoring him like that, it's beautiful. I'm ashamed of how I treated you. Sarah felt tears welling up. Thank you, she managed to say. That means a lot coming from a veteran. Would you mind telling me about him? The old soldier asked. I'd like to know about the man you're honoring. Sarah spent her break telling him about James, about his dedication to his team and his country, about the man behind the memorial. The veteran listened with the respect of someone who understood military service and sacrifice. As Friday approached, Sarah felt nervous about the VFW pancake breakfast. She'd be telling James's story to a large group, including many people who had judged her harshly. But she also felt ready. James had faced much scarier situations with courage, and she could certainly face a community breakfast in his honor. The changes in her life were happening faster than she'd expected, but they felt right. For the first time since James died, Sarah felt like she was moving forward rather than just surviving. She was honoring his memory not just with ink but with courage. Saturday morning brought unexpected butterflies to Sarah's stomach. She'd been invited to speak at the VFW pancake breakfast, and half the town would be there. She'd prepared a small photo album of James, including pictures from their high school days, his graduation from SEAL training, and their last visit together before his final deployment. Danny had driven up from the city the night before, curious about the sudden change in his sister's voice during their phone calls. She'd filled him in on the week's events, and he'd been both proud and protective, wanting to attend the breakfast to support her. You sure you're ready for this? Danny asked as they drove to the VFW hall. You've been hiding this story for months, and now you're going public with it. I think it's time, Sarah replied, touching the sleeve where her tattoo lay beneath the fabric. James wouldn't want me hiding from his memory. He'd want me to stand up and tell people who he really was. The VFW hall was packed when they arrived. The smell of pancakes and bacon filled the air, and the cheerful buzz of community conversation created a warm atmosphere. Frank spotted Sarah immediately and came over to greet her. You must be Danny, Frank said, shaking her brother's hand. Sarah's told us a lot about you. You should be proud of your sister. She's got more courage than most people twice her age. As they found seats, Sarah noticed many familiar faces from around town. Mrs. Henderson was there with her family, looking uncomfortable when she spotted Sarah. Mr. Collins from the grocery store waved and smiled. Mrs. Patterson beamed at her from across the room. The teenagers from the diner were there with their parents, and the young girl who had called her tattoo pretty was sitting with her family. The breakfast portion of the event proceeded normally, with casual conversation and the clatter of dishes. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, though her stomach was too nervous to handle much food. Danny kept up a steady stream of supportive conversation, and the VFW members went out of their way to make her feel welcome. After the meal, Frank stood up and called for attention. Before we wrap up this morning, we've got someone special here who's going to share a story with us. Some of you know Sarah Martinez from around town, and some of you might have noticed the memorial tattoo on her arm. Today she's going to tell us about the hero that tattoo honors. The room quieted as Sarah stood up, her heart pounding. She'd spoken in front of groups before, in college and at work, but this felt different. This was personal, emotional, and carried the weight of months of judgment and misunderstanding. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I lost the most important person in my life. Master Sergeant James Rodriguez was a Navy SEAL. But before that, he was my best friend, my boyfriend, and the man I was going to marry. She pulled out the photo album and held up a picture of James in his dress uniform, young and proud and full of life. James grew up in a military family. His father served in the Marines, his grandfather in World War II. He knew from childhood that he wanted to serve his country, but he also wanted to do it at the highest level possible. Sarah shared stories about James's dedication to his training, his loyalty to his team, and his sense of humor that kept everyone's spirits up during difficult missions. She talked about their relationship, their plans for the future, and the way he'd encouraged her education and dreams. On March 15th, 3 years ago, James's unit was on a reconnaissance mission in Afghanistan when they were ambushed by enemy forces. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the story she'd kept private for so long. 8 men were wounded in the initial attack. James stayed behind to provide cover fire while the wounded were evacuated. He held off the enemy for over an hour, allowing everyone else to reach safety. The room was completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped clearing dishes to listen. James was killed in that action, but every one of his teammates made it home because of his sacrifice. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. At his funeral, his commanding officer told me that James had always said his team was his family, and he'd do anything to protect his family. Sarah showed more photos, including one of James with his SEAL team, their faces bright with camaraderie and purpose. When I decided to get this tattoo, I wanted to create something that would honor not just James, but the values he died defending. Every element has meaning. The coordinates mark the place where he fell. The dates span from his birth to his death. The quote is from the Bible verse that was read at his funeral. She pushed up her sleeve, revealing the full tattoo to the assembled crowd. This time, instead of judgment, she saw understanding and respect on the faces looking back at her. I moved to this town 6 months ago, hoping for a fresh start, Sarah continued. Instead, I found myself hiding this memorial because people made assumptions about what it meant. I let fear and shame convince me to cover up something I should have been proud to display. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Sarah noticed several other people looking down at their hands with expressions of embarrassment. I'm not telling you this story to make anyone feel guilty, Sarah said. I'm sharing it because I learned something important this week. When we judge people based on their appearance, we might be missing something beautiful. When we make assumptions about someone's character based on their choices, we might be wrong about who they really are. Sarah concluded by talking about James's belief in service and sacrifice, and how she tried to honor his memory not just with the tattoo, but by taking care of her brother and working to build a good life. When she finished speaking, the silence stretched for several seconds before Frank started clapping. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, and Sarah felt tears of relief and gratitude threatening to fall. Several people approached her afterward to apologize for their previous treatment and to ask more questions about James. Mrs. Henderson surprised her by offering a sincere apology and asking if she could see the photo album. The high school students asked thoughtful questions about military service and sacrifice. Most meaningfully, several veterans in attendance shared their own stories of loss and memorial, creating connections that Sarah hadn't expected. She realized that in telling James's story, she'd opened a door to a community she hadn't known existed in this small town. As they drove home, Danny was quiet for several minutes before speaking. I'm proud of you, he said simply. And I think James would be too. You honored his memory today in a way that went far beyond that tattoo. Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. The secret was out, the story was told, and she was no longer hiding the most important part of her life. Whatever came next, she would face it with the courage James had always encouraged in her. The week following the VFW breakfast brought changes Sarah couldn't have imagined. On Monday morning, she found a card slipped under her apartment door from Mrs. Patterson, thanking her for her courage and including a generous tip for all the times I should have spoken up when others were judging you unfairly. At the grocery store, customers who had previously avoided her were now going out of their way to be friendly. Some asked about James, others simply treated her with the basic respect she'd been missing for months. The assistant manager position Mr. Collins had mentioned became official when he posted the job description and personally encouraged her to apply, but the most unexpected change came Tuesday evening at the diner. Sarah was wiping down tables when a man in a military uniform walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. Sarah noticed the special warfare insignia on his uniform and felt her heart skip a beat. The man approached her station and asked to be seated. As Sarah led him to a booth, she noticed him glancing at her tattoo with an expression she couldn't quite read. She felt nervous, wondering if this was another person who would judge her for wearing military memorial ink as a civilian. I'll be right back to take your order, Sarah said, but the man held up a hand to stop her. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the authority of command. That tattoo on your arm, is that Master Sergeant James Rodriguez? Sarah's blood ran cold. She nodded, suddenly terrified that she was about to be confronted by someone who thought she had no right to honor James's memory. I'm Commander Michael Thompson. Navy SEALs, the man said, extending his hand. James Rodriguez was one of my men. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. This was James's commanding officer, the man who had spoken at his funeral, who had told her about James's final act of heroism. She hadn't seen him since the memorial service 3 years ago. Commander Thompson, Sarah managed to say, shaking his hand with trembling fingers. I remember you from the funeral. I remember you too, Sarah. You're the woman James talked about constantly. The one he was going to marry when he came home. The commander's expression was serious but kind. I was in the area for a training exercise and heard through military channels that someone in this town was honoring one of my fallen SEALs with memorial ink. I had to come see for myself. Sarah felt tears threatening. I hope it's appropriate. I know I never served, but James meant everything to me and I wanted to carry his memory with me always. Commander Thompson studied the tattoo carefully, taking in every detail. May I? He asked, gesturing to examine it more closely. Sarah extended her arm and he spent several minutes looking at the artwork. This is one of the finest military memorial tattoos I've ever seen, he said finally. Every detail is accurate, respectful, and meaningful. The coordinates are correct, the dates are right, and that quote, James used to say that verse meant everything to him. Relief flooded through Sarah. People in town didn't understand what it was. They thought it was gang-related or disrespectful. Ignorant people often fear what they don't understand, Commander Thompson replied. But this is beautiful, Sarah. James would be honored to know you carry his memory this way. The commander sat down and ordered coffee, then spent the next hour sharing stories about James that Sarah had never heard. He talked about James's leadership qualities, his dedication to his team, and the respect he'd earned from every person he'd served with. I need to tell you something, Commander Thompson said as their conversation continued. James's actions that day weren't just heroic, they were strategically brilliant. He identified the best defensive position, calculated the optimal fields of fire, and executed a holding action that military tacticians are still studying. He didn't just save 8 men through courage, he saved them through intelligence and skill. Sarah felt a new surge of pride in James's memory. She'd known he was brave, but hearing about his tactical expertise from his commanding officer added another dimension to her understanding of the man she'd loved. There's something else, the commander continued. James's team has stayed in touch over the years. They're all out of the service now, but they get together annually on the anniversary of that mission to honor James's memory. This year marks 3 years, and we're having the gathering next month. Would you consider joining us? The invitation was unexpected and overwhelming. I'd be honored, Sarah said through tears. Good. I'll send you the details. Commander Thompson finished his coffee and prepared to leave. Sarah, I want you to know that what you've done here, standing up for James's memory, fighting to honor him properly despite ignorant opposition, that takes the same kind of courage James showed. He'd be proud of you. As the commander stood to leave, something unexpected happened. The diner had gradually filled with the evening crowd, including several of the VFW members, some high school students, and various townspeople who had heard Sarah's story at the breakfast. Frank from the VFW had been sitting at the counter and had overheard parts of the conversation. As Commander Thompson prepared to pay his bill, Frank stood up and approached him. Commander, I'm Frank Morrison, Vietnam veteran and VFW post commander. I want to thank you for your service, and I want you to know that this young lady has shown remarkable courage in honoring your fallen soldier's memory. Other patrons in the diner began to take notice of the interaction. The high school students looked up from their homework. Mrs. Henderson paused in her conversation, and even the kitchen staff emerged to see what was happening. Commander Thompson looked around the room, taking in the faces of the small-town community. Sarah told me she faced some challenges when she first moved here because people misunderstood her tattoo. That's true, Frank admitted. But once we understood what it really represented, this community rallied around her. We're proud to have someone here who honors our fallen heroes. The commander nodded approvingly. That speaks well of your town. Military families need community support, and that includes the families of our fallen. As Commander Thompson prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah one more time. Keep honoring his memory, Sarah. Keep telling his story. The world needs to remember heroes like James Rodriguez. After he left, the diner buzzed with excited conversation. Sarah felt a new sense of validation and purpose. Having James's commanding officer not only approve of her tattoo, but praise her courage in defending it, felt like a final vindication of everything she'd been through. That night, Sarah called Danny to tell him about the encounter. It feels like everything is finally falling into place, she told him. Like James is somehow making sure I'm taken care of, even now. For the first time since James's death, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, honoring the memory of a hero in a way that made a difference. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, preparing for what would be one of the most important days of her life. She was getting ready to attend the annual memorial gathering for James's SEAL team, and her hands shook slightly as she applied makeup. Today, she would meet the 8 men whose lives James had saved, and she would finally complete a circle that had been left open for 3 years. The gathering was taking place at a lakeside retreat in Colorado, about a 2-hour drive from Sarah's town. Commander Thompson had arranged for her accommodation and had sent detailed information about each team member, so she wouldn't feel like a complete stranger. Danny had wanted to come for support, but Sarah felt this was something she needed to do alone. As she drove through the mountain roads, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 1 month. She'd been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store, which allowed her to quit the diner and focus on one job with better pay and benefits. More importantly, she'd found a sense of community and purpose she hadn't felt since James died. The retreat center was beautiful, nestled among pine trees with a clear lake reflecting the mountains. Sarah spotted the group immediately. 8 men in their 30s and 40s standing near a memorial stone they'd apparently installed for this gathering. Commander Thompson saw her approaching and waved her over. "Gentlemen," he called out, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, James's fiancée." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. These tough, battle-hardened men surrounded her with embraces, handshakes, and words of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. Each man introduced himself and shared a brief memory of James, painting a picture of a soldier who had been not just respected but genuinely loved by his teammates. "Rodriguez saved my life that day," said Mike, a stocky man with kind eyes. "I took shrapnel in the leg and couldn't move. He dragged me to cover under heavy fire, then went back for the others. He kept us calm," added Tony, a tall man with graying temples. "When everything went to hell, James was the voice of reason. Kept giving us coordinates, telling us exactly where to go and when to move. Without his leadership, none of us would have made it." Each man had a story, and Sarah found herself learning new things about James with every conversation. She heard about his sense of humor during difficult missions, his skill at poker during downtime, his habit of calling her every chance he got and talking about their future together. The formal memorial service was held at sunset beside the lake. Commander Thompson spoke about James's tactical brilliance and personal character. Each team member shared a memory or a lesson they'd learned from him. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found herself talking not about loss and grief, but about love and legacy. "James always said his team was his family," Sarah told the assembled group. "He died protecting his family, and he did it without hesitation because that's who he was. But I want you all to know that his sacrifice created a larger family. Through honoring his memory, I've found community, purpose, and strength I didn't know I had." She told them about the tattoo, about the initial judgment and eventual understanding in her small town, about Commander Thompson's visit to the diner, and about how sharing James's story had changed not just her life, but the lives of people who heard it. James's heroism didn't end with his death, Sarah concluded. It continues every time someone learns about courage, sacrifice, and love through his story. You men carry his memory forward through your own service and sacrifice. I carry it forward by refusing to let the world forget what he stood for. After the formal ceremony, the group gathered around a campfire for a more casual remembrance. The stories became more personal, more intimate. Sarah learned that James had carried her photo on every mission, that he'd shown it to everyone he met, that he'd talked about their wedding plans constantly. "He was going to surprise you with a house," revealed Jake, a quiet man who had been James's closest friend on the team. He'd been saving his deployment pay and had already put money down on a place near the base. He wanted to carry you over the threshold when he got home. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. In 3 years, she'd never known about the house, about the specific plans James had been making. She'd known he loved her and wanted to marry her, but learning about these concrete preparations for their future brought a new wave of grief mixed with gratitude. The next morning, before the group dispersed, Commander Thompson pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I have something for you," he said, handing her an envelope. "James asked me to give this to you if anything happened to him. I've been waiting for the right time. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in James's handwriting, dated just weeks before his final mission. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home to you. I'm writing this because I need you to know some things, and I need you to make me some promises." The letter went on to express James's love for her, his gratitude for their relationship, and his hopes for her future, but the part that meant the most to Sarah came near the end. "I know you, Sarah, and I know you'll want to blame yourself or think you should have done something different. Don't. I chose this life because I believe in protecting the people I love and the values that matter. If something happens to me, it will be because I was doing what I was meant to do. Promise me you won't hide from life after I'm gone. Promise me you'll keep being the strong, beautiful, intelligent woman I fell in love with. Promise me you'll find happiness again, even if it looks different than what we planned. And promise me you'll remember that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, but it continues. Carry our love forward into whatever life you build. Make it count for something." Sarah was crying by the time she finished reading, but they were tears of healing rather than just grief. For 3 years, she'd been focused on honoring James's death. His letter reminded her that she should also be honoring his life by living fully herself. The drive home gave her time to process everything she'd experienced. She thought about the promise James had asked her to make about not hiding from life. Moving to the small town and covering her tattoo had been a form of hiding. But standing up for his memory, telling his story, and connecting with his team represented the kind of courage he'd wanted her to have. When Sarah arrived back in town, she drove straight to the war memorial in the park. It was the same memorial she'd visited on her darkest nights, wondering if she was strong enough to keep going. This time she wasn't there to question her strength. She was there to make a promise. Standing before the monument in the fading light, Sarah spoke aloud to James's memory. "I promise I won't hide anymore," she said. "I promise I'll keep telling your story and living a life that honors what you stood for. And I promise I'll find a way to make our love count for something bigger than just our own happiness." As she walked back to her car, Sarah felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since James's death. She wasn't moving on from him. She was moving forward with him, carrying his memory and his values into whatever came next. The tattoo on her arm would always mark her as someone who had loved and lost a hero. But more than that, it marked her as someone who had found the courage to honor that hero's memory in the face of judgment and misunderstanding. James had died protecting his family, and Sarah had learned to live protecting his legacy. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. She had kept faith with James's memory, found her courage, and discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple determination to tell the truth about love, sacrifice, and what really matters in life.